Hello and welcome to another edition of Talking Wild Madness. This is Adam. We're recording this one about, I don't know, we must be maybe 30 meters from the King River in Albany. I was going to drive down all the way and actually record it on the banks of the King River, but we've had a lot of rain and I can't quite get in there. And the last time I drove the car close to it, I ended up getting bogged. And my good friend John, who was down for a music trip to Kalgoorlie, saved the day and ended up putting branches and twigs behind the tires, and we had to push it out. And it just was no good. So, in the interest of not getting bogged, and because John's not here, and I don't feel like putting twigs behind the tires, we're gonna be 30 meters away instead of right on the bank. But what is the plan soon is we're gonna do a podcast. We're gonna do a podcast recording in the actual river itself. I just have to roll up these windows because there are flies everywhere. We're going to actually do a podcast in the river. I'm opening the door just to let these flies out. So we're going to do a podcast submerged in the river, in the King River, and we'll see how that goes. I'm not sure how that's going to go. I'm a bit worried about dropping the machine in the water, but these flies! Oh, get out! But we'll see how we go. Wilco is outside on the grass, and he's looking in at me, and it looks like he's saying, "Why on earth are you not out here? What are you doing in there, talking into that little box that you've got in your hand?" And I think I understand exactly what Wilco's thinking. There is one fly. Oh my Lord! There's one fly that's still in here, and he is. Oh no! Now there's two. Now they've multiplied. These flies. Now there's one out. There's one over there. Now there's a policy. There's a podcast policy. That each podcast just gets recorded, and then there's no editing, and there's no. Oh, he snuck back in. There's no editing, and there's no redos. So this is going to be. I didn't count on these flies, so this one will. Yeah, this is a little bit. This is a little bit of a distraction, and already I'm thinking. Okay. Hang on, there's a fly on the inside of the door, and I tried to get him with my R2-D2 beanie that I stole off my son, but I don't think I got him. I used to love all creatures equally. Actually, there was one time where I was working in the prison as a guitar teacher, and I was there. I was almost there every day, and I was almost there every day for 5 years. And there was an Irish fella called Jim. And Jim he would have been nearly 60 years old. But Jim didn't even know how old he was, because Jim was an orphan. He grew up in Dublin. And he was an orphan, so he never actually knew his real birth date. And it was very interesting because he was a lovely guy, and he used to do like a I wouldn't go so far as to call it a psychology course, but it was a halfway between a psychology instruction course, a critical thinking course, a self-awareness course, and a self-regulation course. And he used to come in, and he'd come in regularly. And at the prison where I worked at that time, it was a remand center. So that's the prison you go to straight after you're arrested. if you're arrested and charged and you're not getting let back out, that's where they're going to send you. They're going to send you to the remand center. So it wasn't a jail that was full of sentenced prisoners or lifers or whatever. It was a jail where it was basically limbo. It was basically limbo, which made it hell, which made it even more hellish, which made it more chaotic, because everybody in there was super unsure of what was happening. They were fresh off the street, so to speak, so they weren't in there for very long. It was a very, very chaotic, uneasy, unnerved place to be. And if you can imagine the stress of that, and maybe you have gone through this, but if you can imagine the stress of awaiting a verdict, you're awaiting the trial, you're awaiting the judgment that's going to come down on you, and you have to wait. You have to wait for 3 months or 6 months, and I think the amount of time, the maximum amount of time was, I think it was 2.5 years that you were allowed to keep a prisoner on remand in Western Australia. And if you didn't, if you didn't sentence that prisoner after 2.5 years, then you had to let them go. And when I say you had to let them go, you didn't have to let them go with a compensation for the last couple of years that you'd kept them in prison. You just literally opened the front door of the prison, and I think you had to give them $100 and a bus pass, and you gave them a plastic bag with all their jail belongings and the belongings that they came in with. So if you can imagine that tense environment, but times 900 people, times 900 men stuck in a prison situation, and no one knows what the future holds. No one knows if they're going to be in that situation for another 10 years or 5 years, or whether they'll be let out tomorrow, or whether when their court appearance gets called up in 6 months, whether they're going home or whether they are coming back to prison. And the majority of the people in prison have issues with self-regulation anyway. A lot of the people, almost half of the people, can't read or write. They're not used to expressing themselves. So you've got this heightened sense, like this saturation of anxiety times 900. And you're adding in all this masculine energy. You're adding in all this sexual frustration. And you're putting them in an ugly environment. And that's where I met Jim. And he was trying, he ran a little 2-hour training program where he was basically trying to change how each prisoner thought about themselves, how they thought about their lives. But he was also from Dublin. Now at the time, this is maybe, what am I? I'm 39 now. This would have been 10 years ago. So I would have been in my late 20s, and Jim was in his early 60s, and he came from Dublin, I came from Dublin, but he constantly made the mistake or the error of thinking that me and him were from the same part of the universe, and geographically somehow a flight got back in, and geographically we were both from Dublin, but our realities were completely different. We may as well have been from different planets. And me and Jim got on very, very well, and we used to have a lot of laughs. We got on very well. But every now and then he would, and maybe maybe it was a testament to the level of comfort that we had with each other. Every now and then he would slip into this perspective that not only were we from geographically the same place on Earth, but we'd also shared an identical upbringing, and we'd come from the same background, and we'd even been in the same orphanage. Now I grew up in a suburb outside of Dublin called Rathfarnham, and Rathfarnham, it's hard to put it into perspective, because, well, just by the nature of the podcast, there's so many different. Just to give you an example, and I will get back to Rathfarnham very quickly, but we have listeners from, even if you just take the small island of Tasmania, we have listeners from Hobart, Dinnerine, I don't even know how to pronounce it, Launceston. We have listeners from South Australia, from towns called Elizabeth and Windvale. We have listeners from Auburn in New South Wales. We have listeners from Gravesend in Kent in England. We have listeners from Manitoba in Canada and British Columbia in Canada. So it's very hard to describe exactly what Rathfarnham is in relation to Dublin City, because I don't know any of the outer suburbs of Winnipeg or Surrey, BC, or Auburn or Gravesend. By the way, if you're listening again and you are those people in Gravesend or Launceston or Windvale in South Australia, get in touch and leave a message. What's our email? It's talkingwildmadness@gmail.com. Or if you get on the Anchor site, you can actually leave a voice message. Actually, that'd be really nice if we had a voice message. Then we could put it into the podcast. That'd be awesome. That'd be lovely. But anyway, Rathfarnham, it wasn't the swankiest suburb in town, but it was a good suburb in town. Like if you were able to get into Rathfarnham. Now, keep in mind, I was 8 years old when I left, so I'm not a property tycoon or a real estate marketeer. But if you were from Rathfarnham in Dublin in the mid '80s, you'd done okay. You had done okay. You didn't have the house on the hill, but you weren't sharing a 3-level semi-detached with a shared bathroom, with a shared outhouse out the back between 3 families. So it wasn't, like I said, it wasn't a house on the hill, but it wasn't Angela's Ashes either. Well, Wilco needs to get in because it's raining. Oh boy. So Jim, who was, as I said, he was like 60, and he had grown up in Dublin. And I think because we had such a nice rapport together, and Jim really was a gorgeous guy. He was really, really lovely, and he had the best of intentions with the prisoners. As did almost everybody who worked in that space. Yeah, almost everybody did. There was a Scottish Buddhist. I don't know if it's a monk or a nun. I don't know if there's a distinction, but there was a woman, and she was in her 60s as well, and she used to come in on Wednesday afternoons and Friday mornings for free. She didn't get paid. Jim was getting paid, and I was getting paid, but the Buddhist monk, the Scottish Buddhist monk lady, and I've forgotten her name, but she was a gorgeous soul, and she was basically a Buddhist monk. But she didn't have like robes on. She just dressed normally. If you saw her out and about, she would just look like a short Scottish lady with a ginger flat top, which she had, and she rocked very, very nicely. But she would have been about, in her early 60s, and she'd come in on Wednesday afternoons and run a meditation class at the prison, at the jail school. And man, I have to say, you have to give it to these boys that came through the prison, because some of them would just they I don't know if they'd transform forever, as in I don't know if their transformation within the school lasted when they went back outside, back into their world, back into their family, back into their habits, or whatever you want to call it. But some of them would come into the jail, and they didn't have access to booze, they didn't have access to drugs, and some of them just embraced everything that the jail had to offer. And it's important to remember that the jail had nearly fuck all to offer anybody, but it did have that school where you could go hang out with a Buddhist monk for a couple of hours a week. It had the school where you could hang out and play guitar a couple of times a week. It had a space where you could learn how to cook a couple of times a week. It had a space where you could hang out with, say, Jim from Dublin, and approach the idea of thinking differently than how you have been thinking. His program was almost, what's interesting, it's called a program. His program was almost like, let's change your program. Your programming has led you to make these choices, which has led you to end up here. The good news is you ultimately get to choose your own program. You get to rewrite your own software. So in fairness to the jail, it did offer all those kinds of things, and we were all in that together. We really were all in that together, because I remember talking to the Scottish monk. Oh, I wish I remember her name. It might have been something horrendously Scottish, like Morag. It might have been, but I don't think so, because I probably would have remembered it. I think it was like a soft Morag, like maybe a Mava or a Mova or a... I can't remember what it was. But I was chatting with her, and she was so gracious. She was so gracious. And keep in mind, I was getting paid to be there, and she wasn't, and she'd make the trek in twice a week. She would see the mainstream prisoners on the Wednesday afternoon, and the mainstream prisoners, I think it was Wednesday, it might have been a Tuesday afternoon or even a Thursday afternoon, but she would see the mainstream prisoners. So these are your standard armed robbers, murderers, drug dealers, grievous bodily harmers, forgers, etc., etc. But then she'd come in on the Friday, and she would work with the protection unit, and she would run a meditation class for the protection unit. And the protection unit were the pedophiles, the child molesters, the tamps, the guys that owed money in prison, the guys that ran up drug tabs that they couldn't pay off. But the outcasts, the outcasts of the outcasts. And she would come in, she'd come in for both. She'd come in for both groups. And she might get half a dozen guys from the mainstream that would come in, and she might get two, or I actually remember her having a meditation class with the Unit 6 people, but only one person was there. And I remember her running a 2-hour meditation with this one man, this one pedophile, or this one man who had chosen to be a pedophile, or this one man who happened to be a pedophile, or however you want to phrase it. And this small, diminutive, 5'3", stocky Scottish woman with a ginger flat top, who happened to be a Buddhist monk, sat in a plastic chair in a room built in a 1970s prison 40 years after it was built, and sat for 2 hours in a room and closed her eyes and talked softly and talked about self-regulation, self-awareness, being in the moment, existing in the space. And I haven't been in the prison for very long. Well, for 5 or 6 years, 7 years maybe now. And yeah, when I think back on it, I think, I hope that stuff's still going. I hope they still have guitar teachers and cooking teachers and Buddhist monks coming in and men like Jim talking about self-regulation and self-awareness. But myself and Jim, anyway, we had this lovely Irish immigrant bond. But his was more intense because he had been an orphan, and the last thing I am is an orphan. The last thing I am. There's a story about Duke Ellington, that Duke Ellington was born into a family, and his mother didn't let his feet touch the ground for 7 years. She carried him everywhere and looked after him, and there was nothing she couldn't do for him. Yeah, I'm more on the Duke Ellington side of things, to be completely honest. And I wish I was more on the Jim side of things, but I'm not. I have to be honest. I've been very well looked after by my family, and there's Jim as an orphan. And he's an orphan in the 1970s in Dublin in the 1970s. And if anyone knows anything about Ireland, 1970s Ireland is like 1670s New York. It is a different universe. It's a different planet. And Jim was so nuts. When Jim would turn up to the prison, he had half a pinky finger missing, and he never explained it. And people would always ask him, Jim, what the hell's going on with your finger, man? How did you end up losing your finger? And he'd never explain why. But because he was in that role that he was in, and he was basically his version of the Catcher in the Rye. He was trying to help as many people as he could. And the way he knew how to help people, he was trying to make them think better. And he was so obsessed with his little program. And I don't mean little in a, is pejorative the right word? I don't mean it in a pejorative sense, but it was a short program. It was a 2 to 4 hour program where he would get people in a room and he would have his slideshow and he would go through how it is that you can think better. And so when I say little, it was because it was a short program. It was half a day to a day's work for the guys taking the program. And he always used to work on it. He used to work on his program because I'd be chatting with him, and he would say sometimes he'd wake up in the middle of the night, and he would think, I need to change slide 33. I need to change. At the moment, slide 33 is a black and white, almost Escher landscape, and there are trails cut in the landscape, and there's a man on the equivalent of a man-sized hamster wheel running that wheel through the path, through the carved landscape. And he would say, I'd wake up in the middle of the night and I think I need to colorize the wheel. I need to leave everything in black and white, but I think if I colorize the hamster wheel that the man was walking on, if I made that red, that might again, is the word ameliorate, edify, improve? We'll have to look that up. If I was going to ameliorate the slide 33, I would make that hamster wheel red. And I think that would connect more with the boys. He'd always call them the boys. I was about to say the prisoners, but Jim would always refer to the prisoners as the boys. Maybe the boys would appreciate that better. And then he would say, like 2-3 days later, he'd wake up and say, no, the wheel has to be yellow. The wheel has to be yellow. And he would go on and on like that. So he'd be doing the same program. It reminded me of George Burns, the comedian, who I think he lived to be 101, and he was the American Jewish comedian. And he had the horn-rimmed glasses. He was like Woody Allen before Woody Allen, and he smoked that big cigar. And he might have made it fashionable to marry very young women in bikinis. I'm not 100% sure. But George Burns had a similar approach to his act that Jim had in the prison. Like George Burns apparently had the same act, the same hour, for 30 years, 40 years, and he would just travel and perform his act. But it was an act that he kept tweaking. And he would tweak it a word at a time. He was always thinking about it. He was always just thinking about it. Oh, when I make that joke about my ex-wife and the Mercedes, maybe it's funnier if she's driving a BMW instead of a Mercedes. I'll try that tomorrow night at the Alpha Cubana Florida Springs Senior Hotel. And then the next day he'd be like, no, the BMW didn't get as many laughs as the Mercedes. I'm going to go back to the Mercedes. And Jim had a very similar holistic sense towards his training program. He was always thinking about it. But what was interesting is that we had such a nice time together that he would confuse his reality to my reality, and he would say that, well, Adam, Adam, as being a boy from Dublin, it wasn't as good as it wasn't as good back then as we have it now. And I'd have to remind Jim. I'd say, hey Jim, When I lived in Dublin, I had a bidet in the bathroom. I had a bidet in the upstairs bathroom. Now Jim didn't even have a bathroom. Forget a bidet. Jim grew up in an orphanage where you had to go outside and shit in a hole in the ground. And then depending on your behavior, you or your friends would be out there cleaning that hole in the ground. I'm just rolling the windows down again because there's nothing like nature. But I have to say, the flies really are. They're pushing it. They really are pushing it. I wish I knew the sounds that I was listening to. I wish I knew the names of the birds and the trees, so to speak. I was just watching a documentary on New York, and it was very, very fascinating because one of my favorite documentary filmmakers of all time is Ken Burns. And Ken Burns, he's probably most recently famous for doing the Vietnam War and the Civil War documentary. But I came to know Ken Burns years ago, maybe 10 years ago, probably while I was arguing with Jim about me having a bidet in the upstairs bathroom. And him telling me how much LSD he took in early 70s Dublin. Can you imagine what the LSD in 1970s Dublin would have been like? My Lord. It either would have been absolutely terrific, or it would have been like having a strong cup of tea. For Jim's sake, I hope it was absolutely terrific. But I found out today that Ken Burns. Okay, so Ken Burns made that amazing documentary about jazz. It's 15, 20 hours long. It goes from Congo Square to right up until the time he made it, which was like 1980 or 1990. Absolutely incredible. If you're interested if you're interested in jazz, if you're interested in music, if you're interested in filmmaking, or if you're just interested in existence, you need to watch Ken Burns Jazz. You need to watch Ken Burns Jazz. And if you have children or grandchildren, they love it. They love sitting there and watching it. Ken Burns' filmmaking is so good. He also made a 15, 20-hour documentary on the history of baseball in America that goes from the first baseball game in Cooperstown, wherever, in Jerkwater, Illinois, right up until the present day. And I don't like baseball. I've never actually watched a game of baseball, but this documentary is incredible. And I went to New York a couple of years ago. The uni sent me to talk at a race conference because the stuff I was doing at the uni had a bit to do with race and Indigenous Australian, non-Indigenous Australian relations. So there was a race conference in New Jersey that I ended up going to, and one of the speakers was Ken Burns, but he spoke the day before that I got into the country, so I missed him speaking. But Ken Burns is he's in the pantheon of filmmakers. He's a Francis Ford Coppola level of filmmaker. He's a Roman Polanski level filmmaker without the you know what, without the pedophilia. Well, now I can't actually speak for Ken Burns. I don't know, but hopefully it doesn't seem like it. But then again, when does it ever seem like it? We're going to give Ken Burns the benefit of the doubt. So I found out this morning that Ken Burns has a brother called Rick Burns, and Rick, as well as being Ken's brother, is also an incredible documentary historical filmmaker in his own right. And he's made a 15 to 20 hour documentary on the history of New York. And I found this out this morning, and it was early this morning. It was like 5:30 this morning, and I was drinking some coffee. And I'm a simple man. I am a simple man. And I buy a packet of coffee probably once a week. In those packs that are vacuum sealed, and they look like small bricks, and they've got the coffee powder in there. And I just put it in a plunger, and it costs $3 to buy the coffee, the vacuum sealed coffee packs. So I'm standing in my kitchen, and it is 5:30 in the morning, and I've let my $3 coffee brew in the plunger. I've put the plunger down, I've poured a coffee, and then I find out that Ken Burns, master documentary maker, has a brother who also happens to be a master documentary maker. And it was one of those moments where you just thought, this is good. The world is good. Every now and then the world gifts you certain things. And it was almost like it wouldn't even be true. It wouldn't even be true that Ken Burns had a brother called Rick Burns, who also makes amazing American documentary films. That's insane. That's like finding out that Martin Scorsese has a brother called Ricky Scorsese, who also makes incredible Italian-American gangster movies. Like it's absurd. It's absolutely preposterous. But one of the amazing things, well, it's not preposterous. It happens to be true. Ken Burns and Rick Burns are brothers, and they do these things. Can you imagine the Christmas dinners? Can you imagine the sibling rivalry? My Lord. Or can you imagine the Thanksgiving dinners with all the cultural weight and baggage that goes on there? They were talking about the different things that happened in New York, and the documentary is so comprehensive. And I've only watched one episode, but the documentary is so comprehensive that it starts in 1620. Like this is, it goes back to when Manhattan looked like the Isle of Skye or the Isle of Wight or the Isle of Man 100 years ago. Like it goes back to where there's nothing. And they had these incredible stories that there was a farmer who owned a plantation along the East River, and he was a Dutchman called Joseph Bronk. And where his plantation used to be back in the day, back in 1615 or whatever it was, is now the Bronx in America. And that the Dutch East India Company found an Indian trail that went through lower to upper Manhattan, and they widened that Indian trail. And obviously the Indians who had forged the trail were using it to walk on, or who were using it as a passageway, but as a pedestrian passageway. And the Indians who were there had been there since the Ice Age. And they had these walking trails, and the Dutch East India Company widened this walking trail so they could fit their horses, and they could fit their carriages, and so it couldn't be a walking trail, so it could be a commerce trail, and they called it Bridway. And today, that's called Broadway. Insanity, like insanity. And then they talked about the fact that the Dutch, the glorious Dutch, those wonderful race of people. And I have to say, when I'm checking, and I'm getting messages from people who have listened to the podcast, we are yet to hear anybody come in from Holland. We're yet to hear anyone from Amsterdam. But these Dutchmen, is it just Dutch men or Dutch men and women? I think it might be just Dutchmen at this stage. They called a meeting of all the native tribes on the island of Manhattan, and that's when they brokered the deal. That's when they brokered the first and most insane real estate deal to ever go down in American history. And they brokered for the sale of Manhattan Island. Now, when I first heard this story, I heard that that the native Indians sold Manhattan to the Dutch for it was like $7 or $12 and a necklace full of beads and shells. And you hear that and you think, oh, come on now. That's outrageous. But apparently, the figure was the equivalent to $600. So it was more than $7 or $12, and a necklace and a pair of beads. It was $600. Now, if you're growing up as a white man with a bidet in the second story bathroom, and you're told that story as a child, as a young man, as a boy, if you're told that story, the reaction is, oh, really? How could they? Oh, how silly. What do you mean they sold the entire island of Manhattan for $7 and some shells on a string? Well, that's just ridiculous. Now, even with the increase in money, to buy the 14,000 acres of Manhattan real estate for $600, even back in 1620, is still a remarkable deal. But you have to remember, you have to take into consideration that deal, the deal for the Dutch East India Company was a windfall, but the deal for the native Indians, the American Indians, it wasn't even a tragedy because it was so absurd. The idea, the notion that a man could buy land from another man would have just been absurd. It would have been completely and utterly ridiculous. I think it would be I know it would be the equivalent of me saying to you, I'd like to buy the color blue off you, or I'd like to buy the color green from you. How much do you want for the color green? Well, I'll take 60 guilders, a necklace, and the horse that's behind you, and throw in the axe as well. And then I can have the color green. Yeah, sure. Yeah, of course you can. You can have the color green, and I'll throw in brown, and maybe we can do a timeshare on the color purple, and we'll talk about turquoise next year, depending on how this all plays out. The idea of a human selling land to another human, and even in this day and age, and I want to be very clear. Even though I'm saying I had a bidet in the second story of my bathroom when I was a child, I'm not of the Vanderbilt class. I'm not of the Stuyvesant class. I don't have wealth and grounds and all that kind of stuff. But about 10 years ago, I bought a block of land to build a house on, and it's the house I'm living in now. It's the house that's 100 meters from the river, and I'm halfway to the river, if not for the big puddle in the way. But even as recently as, say, 10 years ago for myself, the idea that, okay, I wanted to build a home, I wanted to build a house, and I wanted to build a house in a rural setting. The feeling that I got when I was purchasing the land, because I bought the land, actually I think I bought the land in about 2006, and it's now 2019, and the house has been on it for about 6 years. So I think I bought this patch of earth 10 years before I got around to putting a house on it, or 8 years or whatever. That time doesn't really matter. But the feeling that I had instinctively of, I'm buying this land. Who am I buying this land from? It was a very, very strange feeling. It was a very, very weird feeling. Who am I? Who is selling me this land? Who is selling me this land? I had to go and borrow money from the bank to pay. To this day, I don't even know who that person was that I bought the land of. But how did that person come to own that land? And did that person buy that land from someone else? And if so, how did that person come to own that land? And maybe they bought it from someone else. And then the question just shuffles back. Well, who owns this land? Who has the right to sell this land? It's very, very peculiar. It's very, very peculiar. But you still buy it. You still buy the land. You still build the house. And then you take a sense of ownership over that property. You take a sense of ownership over it. And what do you enjoy most about it? You enjoy the sense of openness and freedom and wildlife. You don't enjoy that it's yours, that it's all mine, like Daffy Duck in Aladdin's cave in one of those cartoons. You don't. That's not what you enjoy. You almost enjoy. You enjoy the landscape and the wildness because it's outside of the worst parts of our human mercantile existence. And yet we've incorporated it profoundly into our existence. Money, land, man. It's interesting. It's interesting to see the amount of wildlife, the amount of animals, even the farm life incorporated into the wildlife that's here. To my left right now, there are about 300 sheep in an enormous paddock. And for some reason, they're all sitting down today. They're just sitting down. Now, if I was to beat my horn, it would probably startle them and they'd all run around. But, we're definitely not going to do that. For all manner of reasons. Over the river, to the other side, there are probably 150 cattle. And over the river, the hill just crests up. And the cattle they're just there. Now they're all standing up. And to my right, there's a scattering of sheep, not as many as there is on the left. And there's a few kangaroos dotted in between the sheep on the right, and they are lying down with their heads up mostly. A few of them have their heads down. And then to the south, over the hill, I can't see it because it's over the hill, but there's a horse farm. I don't know if a horse farm is the right phrase, but there's a big open farm full of horses. And then if I look down to the floor of the car, there's Wilco asleep, absolutely blissed out.